Dave, welcome back to another segment in the Wood Tech series.
Thanks, Jim.
We've talked about the school in the past, the Wood Technology Center out of Seattle. And you guys have curriculum in cabinet building, boat building, and construction, general construction, I guess, right?
Residential carpentry.
Residential carpentry,
right.
That's a better name for it. Yeah, perfect, right? Kind of what we got going here, a little residential carpentry.
Exactly.
And I know as part of that, you teach a program called CORE that everybody has to go through, which is a lot of safety, getting them used to tools, how to use them, what they're for, most efficient practices, things like that. So I felt like we're kind of going to dive right into some of your wheelhouse here. And I was hoping you could run us through circular saw blades. I'd done lumber ever since I was a kid. It seems like we always had something like that on the tool wall. Small to big, different variations, different names on them. I know you know all the ins and outs of them, so I was hoping you could run us through, what's a combination blade, what's a rip blade, what's blah, blah, blah. So I'll listen and probably ask a few questions along the way.
Well, Jim, I can tell you what I know about blades. And what we teach at school is that there's three kinds of blades, and they correspond with the kind of cuts that we make in a piece of wood. First one would be a rip cut, so you're cutting with the grain. And the next one will be a cross cut when you're cutting across the grain. And then if you don't know what you're going to do, or you might be doing both, you need a combination blade. Okay. So those three blades. And it's pretty easy to tell from a long way away which ones they are. I'll pick one up here, and this is a rip blade. And you can see that it has very deep gullets. And the gullets, of course, are obviously taking the saw dust away. And it has good sized teeth. And in addition, we'll talk about the teeth in a minute, but a rip blade has very few teeth. Okay? And it's meant to be a very aggressive blade. The difference in ripping a piece of wood with a crosscut blade is immediately known.
So Dave, when you talk about the few teeth, do you still get a decent quality cut in a rip, or are they just thinking anybody who's doing that, they're going to run it through a joiner or do something else to clean it up?
We have new ones, which I've got here, and I'll show you, called a glue joint rip. It's a pretty smooth cut. It's not as good as going over the sawn edge with a jointer, you're right. But at the same time, it's a pretty good edge. Now this, because of all the teeth, all right, this is a crosscut blade. And you would use it for plies, any kind of veneered work.
Are you worried about tear out?
Yeah, you're worried about tear out. It's a very clean cut. But if you try to rip with this blade, you will be very disappointed. It's slow, and usually smoke tells you it's an indication you're using the wrong blade.
Is it because you don't have those gullets you just referenced?
Yeah, because you're taking away a lot of material. I read one time that it takes 5 times more force for a saw to rip than it does to crosscut. So at any rate, that's the crosscut blade. And then again, if you're going to be shifting back and forth and don't want to keep changing blades, you would get a combination blade. And there you can see we've got a deep gullet. That would be the rip. And then some smaller ones for the crosscut, and then back to a rip. And the number of teeth on the blade is a big indicator. Again, for a rip blade, you're not going to have many teeth. But for a crosscut blade, you can have a lot of teeth. This also means a big thing. Obviously, when you send this out for sharpening, this is a lot cheaper than our crosscut blade because there are just fewer teeth.
Might be a silly question, but does number of teeth, number of carbide teeth, sort of equate with the expense or the value of the product you're cutting? If it's, say, sheet goods, for instance, if I'm cutting up $30 sheet CDX versus $150 sheet walnut, am I going to want to go with a 80-tooth carbide blade versus a 24-tooth?
Or maybe even 100-tooth, depends. Part of your issue with like plies in general, when we go with the grain on a panel, so 4 foot by 8 foot, the 8 foot is the long way. When we go ahead and cut that way, we're essentially ripping. But because you have all these plies underneath, it's a crosscut blade that you use. What you will find is it slows down. A rip blade is a very fast cut. But a crosscut blade is much more, how would I say it? You're going to take your time with it because you want a good feed rate that's going to give you a good product.
Interesting. The other thing I was really hoping you could touch on for me today would be the concept of set with respect to the teeth. I guess one is, what is it as far as definition for one? And then what are all the differences in how they handle that and why?
Okay. Well, we can take that back to saw blades that are hand saw blades. And we often at school talk about where the derivation came from. Why do we have saw set? And one of the reasons is when they started making saw blades, they would, shape the teeth and everything. And they would realize when you're going into a piece of wood, it would bind. Yeah. So the first thing they started doing was starting to bend one tooth one way, bend it the other way, bend. Right. And so it was alternating. Yeah. And that provided saw clearance for the blade to go through. These are the same thing. Now, if you take something like this and if you feel your way out, you'll notice that the carbide is thicker than the actual saw plate. The saw plate is the steel that the carbide is basically brazed onto. Yeah. So that provides the saw set that we used to have. In fact, I got a little picture here for you. Okay. So on this one, this is the old style. We're going to bend a tooth one way, bend a tooth another way. I still have circular saw blades like that. But if you'll notice over here for this particular rip tooth, you've got a bit of clearance here from the edge. And that allows the saw blade to go through and not to bind. Okay. So the carbide is always a little thicker than the saw plate.
Keep things a little cooler too.
It's basically more for binding than anything else. Now you're right, for cooling, then what we can do is we can add some relief cuts onto the saw blade. I think this one's a pretty good example, Jim. You take a look. We have a lot that it's actually for sound deadening as well. What will happen is as you're going through something and you've got a lot of wood buried into that saw blade, it's going to heat up. So it allows it to expand without warping the blade.
Okay.
Now this is the new style rip, and if you hold it up and take a look, you're going to see a spur right after the tooth. And what that spur is doing is it's limiting the amount of wood that can go into that gullet. Let me take a look at something like this.
Okay.
This one has no spur, and so they call that an anti-kickback spur. Now, since most of the modern saws use riving knives, which we'll deal with later on, this is not as big a deal. But if you don't have a riving knife on your saw, which is a little basically divider that's right behind the saw blade, this will help you from kickback. And a kickback on a rip can be pretty severe.
Gotcha. I think we can all relate to trying to make a nice cut on some valuable piece or some highly visible piece of plywood, from putting masking tape on it to cutting it upside down to whatever kind of magic we can do. But could you show us maybe a sample of a piece of material that gets cut well versus cut maybe not as well as we'd like?
Well, one thing that we are all using now, especially for cabinet makers, is a pre-finished plywood. If you go pre-finish and you're ripping with the grain, it's a pretty smooth cut almost no matter which one you use. But if you're going cross grain and you have this very chippy pre-finished plywood, it tends to tear out. So I've got an example that you can see here. And these are two brand new blades. One, or the cuts that, and you're looking at the kerf here. This is a laminate veneer blade, so a really nice cross-cut blade. And the other one is a combination blade. Now,
so this one, right?
Exactly. Okay. So if you can imagine, Jim, this is being passed over a table saw, and the blade, of course, is coming in this direction.
So it's knocking it down, holding it down on the face, so to speak.
And so all the fibers are supported, but on the back side, they're not. So when you look here, you can see the bottom of the combination blade, and here's the bottom of the laminate veneer blade. So again, if you're trying to make super clean cuts, this is really important.
Yeah. The other thing I want to talk to you about was just, I've seen blades that are out there that are called thin kerf. So I'm assuming thin kerf versus regular kerf. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. The kerf, of course, is the slot left by the saw as it's doing the cutting. And I like to think of it this way. If you were able to reduce the thickness of the saw plate and the carbide, the saw is doing a lot less work. So this is really important for our job site saws because, really, when you think about it, it's nothing more than a circular saw that's bolted into a frame. True. So it's a fairly underpowered saw. So the standard kerf for most of us is around 1/8 of an inch. If I'm able to reduce that to a little over a 1/16, I'm taking basically half as much wood out. And the saw RPMs stay way up, you get a cleaner cut. It's a faster cut. However, if you go through with a piece of plywood and you go like this, you're going to bend that thin curved blade and you're going to cry, because it's usually a lot more money too.
Yeah.
But these are pretty standard at about 1/8 of an inch.
Okay.
Now, bringing it down to a portable circular saw, it's pretty obvious as you look at these two, which one is a rip blade and which one is a crosscut blade.
Sure.
And I still remember a time when it was kind of embarrassing. My friend and I had the blade in your left hand there doing the crosscut, and we were ripping filler stock for this kitchen. And we're wondering, geez, why is the saw hanging up, and what is going on? And it took us about 2 rips before we realized, oh, we needed to change blades. And the minute we did, it was a beautiful cut.
Totally different.
Yeah.
I'm looking at this blade, just noticing there's a lot of carbide on each tooth. Seems like there's, that?
We tend to find, the thing is, if you have a lot of carbide, you can go through a lot of sharpenings.
Okay.
Now, this is really big for us, because this blade here is 10 inches when it's new. Every time you send it out to get sharpened, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right.
And with the saws that we have at school, it's really important that you size the blade and you adjust the brake behind the blade to make sure that it's not going to suddenly trip. And so if you change from an older blade that's been sharpened 3 times to a brand new blade, you just change from something that's probably 9 5/8 back up to 10.
Okay.
So it does make a difference in the overall size. But a blade like this can probably be sharpened, I don't know, easily 3, maybe even 4 times.
Okay.
You need a good sharpening service, though.
Yeah. With that, is there a rule of thumb, I guess, as far as initial investment in a blade, to where, okay, I paid $90 for this blade. Is there a tipping point? If you spend $40 or more on a blade, do you sharpen it, or do you throw it out? Is there any kind of rhyme or reason to that?
Last time I sent out a comment, I sent out actually for a crosscut blade, it was about $35 to have it sharpened. It was an 80 tooth. Okay. So you're right, but you do get what you pay for, and the people that really make decent blades, it's worth every bit.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, in addition to the 3 blades, you also have the teeth themselves, okay? And the teeth themselves are shaped a certain way depending on what you're cutting.
Okay.
So I've got a little drawing here, badly done, but get an idea.
Get the job done.
On a rip blade, you'll see that it's kind of tombstone shaped and it's flat. We call that a flat top grind. So that's the shape of the tooth.
Okay.
And there it's like a chisel just going through the wood in a rip orientation. Now for crosscut, we want sharp little chisels on each side. So you see the teeth here, we're alternating that top bevel, and they call that ATB, alternating top bevel. So flat top grind, alternating top bevel.
Okay.
And then sometimes we mix them. So for instance, on this combination blade, you'll see that this is a flat top grind, but then alternating top bevel and back to flat top. And that makes perfect sense because this is the rip tooth.
Gotcha.
So we can actually blend these teeth and make some pretty interesting cuts, and it's a lot more efficient.
Wow.
So that's the standard, but they came up with a new one a while back. And this one literally has 3 facets, Jim, okay? And they call the 3 facets a triple chip. So for instance, if you were doing some acrylic or a polycarbonate like Lexan, and we often cut plastics, a triple chip will really give you a very nice surface on that. And what we're finding is they're actually starting to mix and match. I have this glue joint rip blade here, and every other tooth, which I would never have thought of for a rip, is actually one of these triple chip teeth. So 3 blades, combination, crosscut, and rip, and 3 teeth. Okay, so basically the flat top grind, mostly for ripping, the alternating top bevel for cross cutting, and then the triple chip, which will get you in trouble a whole bunch of different ways.
Wow. That's awesome information. I'm really glad we did this segment.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, David.